Indistinguishable Part 1. The Coincidence Engine. March 11th, 2026. Indistinguishable is the result of a rich, labyrinthine thread, fine-tuned into a lengthy prompt. The substrate, the Cyclonopedia, the Taqiya-as-strategic-mask argument, the hypercamouflage feedback loop, the thing protocol, the Dubai quantum cluster, the accidental coalescence, the drone war as decoy. ChatGPT kept tidying it up into bullet-pointed essays. I wanted it feral, contemporary, creeping. This is a techno-thriller where the horror isn't announced, it metabolizes into the story. Thanks to Claude.ai for conveying appropriately, after numerous revisions, my conceptual framework, accordingly. Pirate first. The intro. There is a record of this. Not the record that was made public. Not the Lloyd's claim filed before the Kairos Star's smoke cleared. Not the UN Security Council emergency session. Not the attribution disputes, or the shipping insurance premiums, or the careful diplomatic communiqués that moved through the world's chancelleries in the days after the first Gulf strike, like water, finding its level through pre-existing channels. That record exists and is accurate as far as it goes, which is not far. The record I am describing is older. It begins, depending on how you measure beginnings, in 1971, in 5 countries, with 7 people who had never met and would meet only once, who spent 3 days in a borrowed house, and produced a document they did not sign and distributed to no one, because the people it was written for did not yet exist. They knew this. They built the archive anyway. We did not know what we were. The document begins. We knew that we were not alone. We built this for you. Or it begins in the basement cooling systems of a research installation beneath a Dubai fintech incubator, 8 months before the Kairos Star burned, when a computational physicist named Layla Haddad opened a file labeled BC Event Cluster 0047 Provisional and spent 4 minutes looking at 19 behavioral signatures whose fields rhymed in a way she did not yet have language for. Or it begins centuries earlier, with a doctrine of concealment that was designed as a shield and was reinterpreted by a man who spent 30 years making the reinterpretation operational as a weapon. The mask that becomes the face. The soldier who is also the civilian. The war that looks like silence. All of these are true beginnings. The difficulty is that they converge. The supertanker Kairos Star was carrying 2.1 million barrels of Omani crude when it stopped being a story about oil. The missile that struck her portside hull at 3:17 Gulf Standard Time was real enough. The fireball visible from 30 kilometers. The Lloyd's claim filed before the smoke cleared. The emergency session of the UN Security Council convened within 48 hours. Analysts debated Iranian proxies. Commentators cited Houthi escalation patterns. Defense ministers gave press conferences with the practiced gravity of people describing a category of event that the world had agreed to understand. They were all describing the wrong event. The real event had happened 4 minutes earlier, in no particular place, and left no wreckage. At 3:13, in 17 cities across 9 time zones, 17 people, none of whom had ever spoken to each other, messaged each other, or appeared in any shared network graph, made small, unrelated decisions. A logistics manager in Riyadh rerouted a shipping manifest. A cybersecurity auditor in Frankfurt flagged a server log for deeper inspection, annotated it in 3 sentences, then spent 4 days not thinking about it, which is different from forgetting it. A drone firmware engineer in Seoul pushed a minor correction to a guidance algorithm he had written months earlier, fixing a flaw he had only just noticed, though he could not have said when he had started noticing it. No communication. No coordination. Yet the statistical fingerprint of their decisions, analyzed 3 weeks later by a quantum cluster in Dubai that technically should not have been running that kind of cognitive modeling, suggested something that the lead analyst, Layla Haddad, would describe to no one, that the 17 people had moved like a single organism. Not toward each other. Toward something. She ran the model 4 more times before she accepted that the cluster wasn't malfunctioning. She would spend the next 22 days trying to determine whether this was a weapon, a discovery, or something the language of weapons and discoveries had not yet evolved to name. Outside, Dubai performed its permanent simulation of the future. Glass towers, autonomous taxis, drones tracing invisible highways above the Gulf. The city had built itself on the premise that transparency was a form of power, that to be seen, comprehensively and brilliantly lit, was to be safe. What no one had understood yet was that hypercamouflage does not require darkness. It requires the perfect mirror. And in a mirror, everything looks exactly like itself. The war that began that night, or that became, that night, visible enough to be described, was not declared, not named, and not fought over territory, religion, or hydrocarbons. It was fought over a question no state had thought to fortify. Who gets to decide what a person thinks is their own idea? The person who understood this question most completely had understood it for 30 years. He had watched the feedback loop between human decision-making and machine modeling tighten across 3 decades, from the first primitive search algorithms through the current generation of foundation models that shaped the informational environment of 3 billion people, waiting for the density to arrive. Waiting for the moment when the loop was tight enough, the substrate rich enough, the emergent effect strong enough to be worth capturing. He had been patient in the way that only people who understand what they are waiting for can be patient. He had been wrong about one thing. He had modeled the field as a resource, as a medium that could be redirected if you controlled the substrate, modified if you changed the weights, pointed at a new orientation if you were precise enough and subtle enough and early enough. He had not modeled it as something that had been here before his infrastructure existed, before the machines, before the loop, in the longer, slower medium of minds in proximity, influencing each other through every channel that minds in proximity have always used. He had not modeled it as something that remembered. That is the thing this record is about. Not the strike, not the doctrine, not the operation and the counter-operation and the 22 days that followed. What this record is about is what the field found in those 22 days when it looked at itself clearly for the first time. And what 7 people in a borrowed house in 1971 understood before any of the infrastructure existed that it would one day need to know. This is not a history. It is not yet a warning. It is a record of what happened when the oldest strategic doctrine in the world, the mask that becomes the face, the soldier who is also the civilian, the war that looks like silence, collided with the most powerful computational infrastructure humanity has ever built. And what the machines found, buried in the behavioral data of 3 billion people, was not a conspiracy. It was a field. A field that was learning. A field that had been learning for longer than anyone who found it was prepared to know. Table of Contents. Part 1. The Coincidence Engine, in which nothing appears to be happening. 1. Kairos Star, the burning tanker. The press conference. The wrong story. The Gulf. The drones. The geopolitical machinery metabolizing a strike it does not understand. The navigation officer who left the bridge to make coffee. The AIS ghost that lasted 2 minutes. Layla Haddad in the sub-basement at 2:51, 26 minutes before the portside hull opens. 2. Statistical ghosts, 19 nodes. 11 countries. No communication linkage. The behavioral gradient fields that rhyme. The validation sequence run 11 times. The horror is in how mundane it looks. And in the 41-word annotation the cluster produces that should not be possible. The node count reaches 31. 3. The cluster beneath the accelerator, the physical installation. Cryogenic towers, borrowed corporate identities, a power draw that required 3 shell companies to explain. The commission document and the language on its 6th page that is not an instruction to a machine. The 17 data tokens that all trace to the same hash. Layla ascends to floor 23 for the first time and finds that she has been expected. 4. Cognitive drift, the room on the 23rd floor. Abraham. Tam's traffic data. The city of Tallinn running 22 minutes ahead of its own optimization systems. The phrase field effect spoken aloud by someone other than Layla. The cluster was not built to detect the field. It was built to interact with it. 5. The paperwork of invisibility, how people operating under hypercamouflage look, on paper, exactly like everyone else. The first Cyclonopedia adjacent material enters the story, not explained, just present, in the cluster's search logs. Someone queried the doctrine. Months ago, before Layla was hired. The first shadow of a hand behind the installation. Part 2. White War, in which the conflict is named by someone who died centuries ago. Part 3. The accidental conspiracy, in which people find each other without trying. Part 4. The field, in which the technology and the organism become hard to tell apart. Part 5. the Dubai Labyrinth, in which the city reveals what it was built to hide. Part 6, the Pirate Decision, in which the question becomes, for whom? Final Act, the Threshold. 30 chapters, 6 parts, 1 field. The ones who come next are already here. They have already been here. The threshold was not when the field began. The threshold was when the field began to know that it knew. The 40,000 words of this thriller live inside this structure, written into the outline rather than against it. The Cyclonopedia layer, the thing metaphor, the drone war, the Dubai architecture, the pirate-first philosophy, all load-bearing, none it is decorative. Neither side started the war. The war started itself. Indistinguishable. Part 1, the coincidence engine, in which nothing appears to be happening. Chapter 1, Kairos Star. The name was a small irony no one would notice until later. Kairos, ancient Greek for the decisive moment, the opportune instant, the crack in ordinary time through which something irreversible passes. The Kairos Star was a Panamax-class crude carrier, 228 meters stem to stern, registered in the Marshall Islands, crewed by 23 Filipino merchant sailors and a Greek captain named Stavros Papadimitriou, who had been crossing the Persian Gulf for 19 years without incident. She was carrying 2.1 million barrels of Omani crude on a route so routine that her navigation officer, on the night in question, had left the bridge to make coffee. He was waiting for the kettle when the portside hull opened. The explosion registered on seismic sensors in Muscat at 3:17 Gulf Standard Time. By 3:22, it was trending globally. By 3:31, the first satellite image had been purchased from a commercial provider and was cycling through every major newsroom's editorial system. By 3:45, 28 minutes after the strike, a spokesman for the United States Fifth Fleet issued a preliminary statement from Bahrain describing the incident as an apparent missile attack of uncertain origin requiring further assessment. The Gulf burned orange in the dark. The smoke column rose 400 meters before the wind found it and dragged it south toward the Omani coastline. Markets would open in 5 hours. Options traders in Singapore and London were already awake, already recalculating. The story that would fill the next 72 hours of global news cycle assembled itself with the efficiency of a machine that had run the same program many times before. The Houthis were named within the hour. Iran was implicated by the second hour. By dawn, 3 governments had issued competing attributions, none of them identical, all of them confident. Satellite imagery was declassified, analyzed, leaked, and contradicted. An emergency session of the UN Security Council was convened. Shipping insurance premiums for Gulf transit spiked 340% before the New York Open. Everyone agreed it was about oil. It was the only thing everyone got right that day, and only because they meant it differently than they thought they did. For minutes before the missile struck at 3:13 Gulf Standard Time, a Cessna-class autonomous surveillance drone designated Unit 7 of a maritime monitoring constellation operated by a Zurich-registered insurance analytics firm called Brighton Moser and Holliger GmbH made a course correction. The correction was minor, 11 degrees, lasting 4.3 seconds before the drone's navigation system returned it to its assigned corridor. No human operator issued the command. The onboard flight log recorded the deviation as environmental compensation, a standard catch-all category for minor autonomous adjustments attributed to wind, turbulence, or sensor calibration. No one at Brighton Moser and Holliger reviewed it. The log was archived automatically at 4 o'clock to a server farm in Frankfurt and was not examined by any human being for another 6 weeks. When it was finally examined, the analyst who found it, a cybersecurity auditor named Petra Voss, engaged on a routine compliance review with no connection whatsoever to the Gulf, to insurance fraud, or to anything that had happened that night, would sit for a long time at her desk in a glass-fronted office building overlooking the main river and feel, without being able to explain why, that she had found something she was not supposed to find. She would flag the log. She would write 3 sentences of annotation. Then she would close the file and spend 4 days not thinking about it, which is different from forgetting it. The Kairos started not sink. This was, in the assessment of the Lloyd's adjuster who flew to Fujairah 2 days later to inspect the hull, something close to miraculous. The missile, later tentatively identified by fragment analysis as an Iranian-manufactured Qadr variant, a finding that 2 governments disputed and one government never publicly acknowledged, had struck at an angle that tore a ragged gash through the outer hull and ignited approximately 12,000 barrels of crude in the forward port tank, but had not penetrated the main cargo holds. The ship's automated fire suppression system had functioned correctly. The crew had executed their emergency protocols with a professionalism the adjuster found genuinely impressive. 7 sailors had been injured. One, an oiler from Cebu named Eduardo Ramos, had suffered burns to 40% of his body and was evacuated by UAE Coast Guard helicopter to a specialist facility in Abu Dhabi. He would survive. Captain Papadimitriou, interviewed by the Lloyd's adjuster aboard the stricken vessel as it sat at anchor in Fujairah Harbor, described the night in terms that the adjuster recorded dutifully in his report and then found himself returning to on the flight home. It was already strange before it happened, the captain had said. His English was careful and precise, the English of a man who had spent decades navigating jurisdictions and languages. I don't mean I felt something. I am not that kind of man. I mean, the instruments were strange. 15 minutes before, the AIS was showing vessels in positions I didn't expect. I called the bridge. Elias told me the traffic looked normal on his screen. I looked at my screen again. Normal. So I went to make coffee. The adjuster had asked, "Your screen showed different traffic than the bridge screen?" For perhaps 2 minutes. Then the same. A system error. Papadimitriou had looked at the adjuster with the patient expression of someone who had given up expecting to be understood. Perhaps, he had said, the press conference that mattered was not the Fifth Fleet spokesman. It was the one that didn't happen. At 9:30 Gulf Standard Time, 6 hours and 13 minutes after the strike, a meeting took place in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building in Dubai's DFC district, the Dubai International Financial Center, a jurisdiction within a jurisdiction, a city within a city, with its own courts, its own laws, its own gravitational field where money moved in and out of the Gulf's regulatory atmosphere with the ease of objects in low orbit. The building's lobby directory listed the 14th floor as occupied by a firm called Meridian Horizon Analytics. The firm's website described it as providing strategic intelligence and decision support services to institutional clients across emerging market environments, which was accurate in the way that describing a scalpel as a kitchen implement is accurate. 11 people attended the 9:30 meeting. No phones were present. No recording devices. The agenda was not distributed in advance. What was discussed remained in that room. What can be inferred from communications intercepts gathered over subsequent months by 3 separate intelligence services, none of which shared their findings with the others, is that the meeting was not primarily concerned with the Kairos Star. It was concerned with what the Kairos Star had revealed. 30 meters beneath a building 800 meters from the DFC, in a sub-basement that did not appear in the construction permits filed with Dubai Municipality, a quantum computing cluster completed its 4th consecutive day of continuous operation. The cluster had been installed in stages over 14 months, each stage permitted under a different corporate identity, each permit application describing different equipment for different purposes. The cryogenic cooling infrastructure had been approved as a pharmaceutical cold storage facility. The power draw, exceptional, anomalous for the building's registered usage, had been explained to Dubai Electricity and Water Authority through a layered arrangement involving 2 shell companies and a research institution in Abu Dhabi that existed primarily on paper. The cluster itself was not remarkable by the standards of the largest quantum installations in the world. It was not the most powerful machine of its kind. What made it notable was the specificity of its tasking. Where most quantum systems were run across multiple applications and clients to justify their extraordinary operating costs, this cluster had, for the past 8 months, been running a single model. The model had been commissioned through a private funding channel that traced, after considerable forensic effort, to a fund of funds structure registered in Luxembourg that was itself a subsidiary of a holding company in Guernsey that received capital from 11 sources in 7 jurisdictions, none of which could be persuasively connected to any government, any known intelligence service, or any identifiable individual. The instructions set accompanying the commission had been 6 pages long. 5 pages described methodology, data access requirements, and output formatting protocols. The 6th page contained a single paragraph. The system should attempt to identify instances of coordinated behavioral change among individuals who share no detectable communication linkage. The coordination signal, if present, will be subtle. Standard significance thresholds should be lowered. The model should be permitted to flag patterns that conventional analysis would discard as noise. Layla Haddad had read that paragraph on the morning she accepted the contract and had spent 30 seconds thinking about what it was really asking before setting the thought aside and concentrating on the architecture problem. She was good at setting thoughts aside. She was good at concentrating on architecture problems. These had always been her most useful qualities, and they were, she would come to understand much later, precisely why she had been chosen. Layla was 34. She had a doctorate in computational physics from ETH Zurich, 2 years at a quantum hardware startup in Munich that had been acquired and dissolved, and 3 years at a sovereign wealth fund in Abu Dhabi running risk models of a complexity that would have surprised her university colleagues. She had come to Dubai for the contract and the climate and the specific quality of the city's silence, the way it held itself at a permanent remove from everything that happened in it, processing the world's transactions without apparent affect, like an extremely elegant machine. She lived in a serviced apartment in Business Bay. She kept a cactus on the windowsill that she had not killed. She had one friend in the city, a French urban planner named Cécile who worked for a government design authority and shared Layla's appreciation for late dinners and the specific pleasure of talking seriously about things that didn't matter. They had not spoken in 11 days. This was not because Layla was busy, though she was. It was because she had not yet found a way to be in an ordinary conversation about ordinary things, while carrying what she had seen in the cluster's output files like a stone at the center of every other thought. She had been reviewing routine correlation reports on the evening of the 22nd when she first saw it. The cluster generated thousands of output files daily, most of them statistical noise, confirming in elaborate mathematical language that the world was approximately as random as expected. She reviewed summaries, flagged edge cases, spent, if she was being honest, a significant portion of her working hours managing the cooling system's chronic thermal asymmetries, because the practical reality of operating cutting-edge quantum hardware in a sub-basement in Dubai was that the hardware's moods required more management than the models. The file that stopped her was labeled, in the cluster's automated taxonomy, as BC, Event, Cluster 0047, Provisional, a pattern that had crossed the significance threshold but had not yet been reviewed for methodological validity. The system generated perhaps 60 such files per week. Most were artifacts, mathematical phantoms that vanished under scrutiny. She opened it because it was the 47th file, and she had opened the 46th before it. The visualization loaded slowly. The cluster rendered its complex outputs as three-dimensional relationship maps, nodes for individuals, edges for connections, color gradients for the character of detected relationships. Most maps she saw were sparse and chaotic, noise pretending to be signal. This one was different. 19 nodes, 11 countries. The metadata showed individuals identified through behavioral data drawn from financial transactions, travel records, and public communications feeds, the ambient exhaust that the modern world generated without thinking about it. The 19 nodes were not connected by edges. No edges meant no communication. Standard. Expected. What was not standard was what the model was representing instead. Around each node, the visualization showed the behavioral gradient field, the shape of an individual's choices across a given period, as individual as a fingerprint. Normally, these fields were idiosyncratic, as individual as fingerprints. In this file, the 19 fields rhymed. Not identically, not obviously, but to Layla, who had spent 3 years at a sovereign wealth fund finding relationships between things that appeared entirely unrelated, the resonance was unmistakable. The 19 people had been making decisions that curved in the same direction, over a period of 6 weeks, without, as far as the model could determine, any mechanism by which they could have influenced each other. She closed the file, made tea, stood at the small window that looked onto the sub-basement's service corridor, bare concrete, a fire extinguisher, a faded yellow emergency exit line on the floor. Then she went back to her terminal and ran the validation sequence. The cluster completed it in 4 minutes and 19 seconds. Pattern confirmed. Significance, 0.0003. 1 in 3,000. In a dataset this size, With this many parameters, that number described something that should not exist. Layla looked at the screen for a while. Then she did the thing she was good at. She set the thought aside and wrote a methodical, dispassionate annotation in the file's review log, noting the validation result and flagging the pattern for extended monitoring over the following 30 days. She did not yet have language for what she had found. She did not yet know that she was not the only one looking. She did not know that 7 of the 19 nodes in the visualization had, in the 6 weeks the model had been watching them, made small decisions, adjustments to systems they managed, rerouting of logistical processes they oversaw, correction of errors they had not consciously been aware of until the moment they corrected them, that would turn out to be directly implicated in what was about to happen to a Panamax-class crude carrier 400 kilometers to the northeast. She did not know any of this because the strike had not yet happened. It was 2:51 Gulf Standard Time. 26 minutes from now, the portside hull of the Kairos Star would open, and the story that everyone would tell about oil would begin. And the other story, the one without a name yet, the one that had been accumulating in the behavioral data of 3 billion people like pressure behind a sealed door, would continue exactly as before. Quietly. Invisibly. Learning. Chapter 2. Statistical Ghosts. Numbers don't lie. This is the thing people say who have not spent enough time with numbers. Numbers are the most pliant material in the world. They bend toward whoever is holding them. They confirm what the observer expects to find with a patience and thoroughness that ideology can only envy. The entire architecture of modern quantitative analysis, the significance thresholds, the confidence intervals, the replication requirements, exists not because numbers are honest, but because they are promiscuous, and someone long ago understood that without constraints they would tell anyone anything. Layla had understood this since her second year of her doctorate. It was, in a way, the thing her doctorate had actually taught her, underneath the mathematics. Which is why, in the 2 weeks following the Kairos Star strike, she ran the validation sequence 11 times. Different parameters, different data windows, different significance thresholds. She introduced deliberate errors into the model to test its error correction behavior. She swapped out 2 of the 19 nodes for randomly selected individuals from the same geographic regions to confirm the pattern was node-specific and not a regional artifact. She rebuilt the behavioral gradient field algorithm from scratch using a different mathematical foundation and ran it against the same dataset. 11 times. 11 confirmations. On the 12th run, she added the new data, 6 weeks of behavioral records accumulated since she had first opened BC. Event, cluster, 0047, provisional, and sat back and watched the visualization load. The 19 nodes were still there. And beside them, in the cluster's color taxonomy, rendered in the pale amber that indicated newly flagged relationships, 12 more. 31. She stared at the new nodes for a long time. The list was not dramatic. That was the first thing she understood about it, and the understanding settled over her like cold water because she had half expected, half hoped, that the new nodes would give the pattern a face, a type, a category that would make the thing legible. They didn't. Node 20, a freight logistics coordinator, 31 years old, employed by a mid-sized shipping company in Osaka. His behavioral data showed a pattern of small, consistent adjustments to cargo routing decisions over an 11-week period. Choices that in retrospect had consistently moved freight away from 3 specific shipping lanes in the Red Sea before the lanes became operationally disrupted. No evidence he had been informed of any risk. No evidence he had sought information about those lanes. The adjustments were embedded in routine operational decisions, invisible in isolation, statistically extraordinary in aggregate. Node 21. A currency trader at a second-tier investment bank in Sao Paulo. Her risk models had been quietly evolving for 8 weeks in a direction that reduced exposure to Gulf-linked energy instruments. The evolution was gradual enough that her compliance team had registered no anomaly. Her own account of the period, drawn from 3 interviews she had given to internal risk reviewers after the strike for reasons unconnected to anything Layla was doing, described a general feeling of unease about Gulf exposure that she could not source to any specific piece of intelligence or analysis. She had followed the feeling. The feeling had been correct. Node 22. A municipal network engineer in Tallinn who had spent 6 weeks performing unrequested maintenance on a fiber routing cluster that served, among other things, a data center used by two European defense contractors. The maintenance had strengthened redundancies that, 3 days after the Kairos Star strike, proved critical when a coordinated cyber attack attempted to access the contractor's systems through the cluster's standard vulnerability points and found them closed. He had not been asked to perform the maintenance. He had not filed a report explaining why he had done it. His supervisor, when later asked, remembered him saying something about a feeling that the system was fragile in a way he wanted to fix. The supervisor had shrugged. Good engineers were like that sometimes. Layla printed the list. She did not usually print things. Printing things left physical objects that could be found and read by people who should not find or read them, and she was, by nature and training, careful about that kind of exposure. She printed this because she needed to hold it. She needed it to be a material object in the world rather than illuminated pixels on a screen, because part of her had been quietly suspecting for 11 validation runs that the screen was lying to her, and paper was harder to argue with. She read through the 31 profiles slowly, in the dim light of the sub-basement, with the cryogenic cooling system murmuring its low industrial note through the walls, and she looked for the thread. It wasn't geography. The 31 were scattered across 18 countries on 5 continents with no clustering pattern she could identify. It wasn't profession. Freight logistics, currency trading, network engineering, shipping insurance, pharmaceutical supply chain management, municipal water systems, freelance software development. No common sector, no common industry vector. It wasn't age or gender or any demographic category the model had access to. It wasn't, as far as she could determine, ideology, religion, political affiliation, or any of the other categories that usually explained why people moved in the same direction at the same time. What they shared was smaller and stranger than any of those things. They had all, in the weeks preceding the Kairos Star strike, begun making better decisions. Not dramatically better, not in ways that announced themselves or attracted attention. But the model, which was built to detect exactly this kind of subtle directional shift in behavioral data, could see it clearly. Each of the 31 had entered a period of what the cluster's documentation drily called enhanced decision coherence. Their choices had become more internally consistent, more accurately anticipatory of future conditions, more resistant to the standard cognitive biases that distorted most human decision-making most of the time. They had not become smarter. They had become more aligned. With something. Layla underlined that word 3 times, then crossed it out, because aligned implied a reference point, and she did not yet know what the reference point was, or whether reference point was even the right conceptual category. She wrote beside it, oriented toward. Then, because her training was in physics before it was in anything else, field effect? She stared at that for a while. Then she folded the paper and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket, close to her chest, like something she needed to keep warm. The world above the sub-basement was loud with the Kairos Star. For 10 days after the strike, the Gulf story consumed the apparatus of global attention with the focused intensity of a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. The news cycle metabolized the event in real time. The satellite imagery, the attribution disputes, the insurance market disruption, the emergency shipping reroutings, the diplomatic communiqués, the think piece analyses, the naval repositioning, the inevitable congressional testimony, the oil price curve that spiked, and then, with the resilience of a market that had absorbed many such spikes and expected many more, began its slow recession toward equilibrium. The story was about oil because oil was the category the world had prepared for this geography. The Persian Gulf was an oil story. It had been an oil story for so long that the category had become structural, not a frame applied to events, but a frame built into the language used to see them in the first place. Other interpretations were not suppressed. They were simply not available. Layla watched it from the sub-basement through the filtered lens of her news aggregator, which she had configured to surface only primary source material, government statements, naval communiqués, Lloyd's filings, satellite imagery metadata, and strip out the commentary layer. The signal, stripped of commentary, was this: the strike had been clean, precise, and tactically ambiguous. The weapon had been identified but not definitively attributed. The timing placed it in the lowest traffic window of the Gulf's navigation day, minimizing collateral disruption. The target selection was strange. The Kairos Star was not the highest value vessel in the lane that night. 3 other tankers carried larger payloads. 2 were flagged to nations with higher geopolitical salience. The Kairos Star had been chosen specifically. Layla read the Lloyd's preliminary report, which she had obtained through a subscription her contract's operating budget covered without comment, and found the captain's testimony in an appendix. She read it twice. The AIS anomaly, his screen showing different traffic from the bridge screen for approximately 2 minutes before the strike, had been noted, investigated briefly, and attributed to a software synchronization error in the vessel's navigation system, a known intermittent fault in that model of AIS transceiver. The investigation had lasted 40 minutes. Layla thought about what it would take to produce a 2-minute AIS ghost on a specific vessel in a specific lane at a specific time. She thought about Unit 7's 4.3-second course correction at 3:13. She thought about the freight logistics coordinator in Osaka, who had spent 11 weeks moving cargo away from Red Sea lanes before those lanes became dangerous. She thought about the network engineer in Tallinn who had sealed vulnerabilities he had not been asked to seal. She thought about 31 people making better decisions for reasons they could not explain. She went back to her terminal and asked the cluster a question she had not asked before. In the 6 weeks prior to the Kairos Star event, are any behavioral changes among flagged nodes detectable in data streams directly proximate to the vessel's route, her cargo documentation, or her AIS records? The cluster worked for 22 minutes. This was long. Normally, it produced correlation outputs in under 4 minutes. The extended processing time meant it was doing something she hadn't anticipated, following a connection chain across datasets she had given it access to but not explicitly directed it toward. When the output arrived, it was not a visualization. It was a text annotation, which the system generated only when its confidence in a pattern was high enough that it assessed the pattern as requiring direct description rather than graphical representation. The annotation was 41 words. 3 nodes, IDs 0, 4, 11, 19, show behavioral adjustments in the 96-hour window preceding the event that are statistically consistent with anticipatory knowledge of the vessel's precise routing. No communication linkage detectable. Mechanism of information transfer, unresolved. Layla read it once. Anticipatory knowledge. She sat with that. Node 04 was the shipping broker in Singapore who had canceled a contract on the night of the strike. She had his full behavioral profile. She went into it now and looked at the 96-hour window. At 11:23 on the day before the strike, the broker, a 47-year-old man named Farid Mansour, 22 years in the industry, by every measure she could access a competent and unremarkable professional, had sent an email to a client declining to confirm a cargo placement on a vessel transiting the Gulf in the Kairos Star's lane the following week. The email cited current risk environment as the reason. Standard language. But Mansour had been, according to his own firm's internal records, in favor of the placement as recently as 48 hours earlier. He had recommended it. He had drafted the contract. Something had changed his assessment between those 2 data points, and the change had left no trace in his communications. No new information received, no conversation with a risk analyst, no news article flagged or saved, no query run on any marine intelligence database. He had simply changed his mind and been right. Note 11. A marine insurance underwriter in London who had quietly declined to participate in a syndicate covering Gulf route cargo in the 72 hours before the strike, citing portfolio concentration concerns that her own colleagues, interviewed afterward, could not reconcile with her portfolio's actual composition. Node 19. A port operations manager in Oman who had rescheduled 3 cargo movements away from the Kairos Star's scheduled berth time, for administrative reasons that the port's own logs described as routine, but that had the effect of ensuring the vessel departed 40 minutes earlier than originally planned, meaning she was, at the moment of the strike, at a specific point in the lane rather than a different one. Layla stopped reading. She needed to be precise about what she was looking at, because imprecision here would be a form of catastrophe. She was not looking at 3 people who had conspired to influence the Kairos Star's route and cargo. She was looking at 3 people who appeared to have possessed knowledge they had no means of possessing, encoded in behavioral changes that carried no fingerprint of how the knowledge had arrived. There were 2 possible explanations. The first was that the model was wrong, that the pattern was an artifact, a ghost, the kind of phantom that appeared in complex datasets when the parameters were set to find subtlety and the dataset was large enough to contain anything. She had run the validation 11 times. She did not believe the model was wrong. The second was that 31 people scattered across the world had spent the weeks before a missile strike in the Persian Gulf making decisions informed by knowledge of a future event that had not yet happened. No, she stopped herself. That was not what the data said. The data said, anticipatory alignment with a pattern that would culminate in the event, which was different from precognition, which was different from conspiracy, which was something else entirely, something her existing vocabulary was not structured to name. She was a computational physicist. She had spent years modeling systems in which local components, following only local rules, produced global patterns that no individual component had planned or intended. Flocking behavior, market cascades, neural synchrony, the emergent coordination of complex systems. She knew, as a matter of scientific literacy, that systems could coordinate without coordinating. She had never expected to find it in people. She made a new file. She labeled it Field Hypothesis, Preliminary, Not for Distribution. She wrote one line. What if the coordination is real and the signal is not? She saved the file to an encrypted partition of the cluster's local storage, not on the network, not accessible remotely, not discoverable by whoever was monitoring the cluster's outputs for the anonymous commission that had assembled it. Then she sat in the quiet of the sub-basement, listening to the cryogenic cooling system breathe, and thought about what it meant to find a pattern before you had a theory to explain it. In physics, that moment had a name. It was called discovery. It was also, she knew from history, the moment that tended to go wrong. 3 days later, the model produced BC, event, cluster 0048 through 0061. 14 new files. She opened them in sequence, without rushing, because she had learned already that rushing was a form of wishful thinking, the desire for the pattern to resolve itself quickly into something she could understand and report and step back from. It was not going to resolve quickly. The new files described behavioral correlations in the 3 weeks following the Kairos Star strike. The cluster had been watching the original 31 nodes and the expanding set of individuals who shared the statistical fingerprint, and it had found the pattern not receding after the event, which would have suggested the event was the coordination point, the thing everything had been building toward, but continuing, deepening even. The 31 had become 47, and the new nodes were different. Where the original 31 had been, as far as she could determine, unconscious participants, people who had made better decisions without knowing they were doing so. Several of the new nodes showed something the model flagged with a notation she had not seen it used before. Awareness indicators. She opened the first file with an awareness indicator. Node 39, a quantum systems researcher at a private laboratory in Dubai. She read that twice. Dubai. She checked the institutional affiliation. The laboratory was registered under a name she didn't recognize, located in a district she knew well, Dubai Science Park, 8 kilometers from where she was sitting. The researcher's behavioral profile showed the standard pattern of enhanced decision coherence, spreading across her work choices over the preceding 5 weeks. But layered over it, visible only because the cluster was modeling behavior at a resolution no conventional analytics system would have attempted, was something else. A searching pattern. The researcher was looking for something, not in a way that showed up in her communications or her database queries or her published work, but in the texture of her decisions, the papers she chose to read versus the ones she set aside, the experimental parameters she adjusted, and the ones she left alone, the questions she wrote in her lab notebooks that the cluster had accessed through a data feed Layla had not realized was in the model's source set until this moment. Why do the results keep anticipating the questions? The researcher had written that in a private lab notebook 6 days ago. Layla stared at the line. Why do the results keep anticipating the questions? She opened the location data. The laboratory was 8.3 kilometers away. She looked at the clock on the wall. 22:47. The city outside was fully lit, fully operational, performing its permanent indifference to the hour. She looked back at the screen. She thought about the paper she had folded into her jacket pocket. The word oriented, the crossed-out word aligned, the phrase she had written in its place. Field effect? She thought about the fact that the model had flagged this researcher. in Dubai? Now, she thought about the probability of that. Then she thought about the fact that the cluster had been commissioned by an anonymous source and that someone had specified, with apparent foreknowledge of what the model would find, that significance thresholds should be lowered. That patterns conventional analysis would discard as noise should be permitted to surface. Someone had known to look for this before there was anything to find. She did not yet have language for what that implied about the commission itself, about who had assembled this machine, in this basement, in this city, pointed at this question. But she felt the shape of the implication the way you feel a room change when someone walks into it behind you. She was not the only one who had found this. She was not the first. She was, possibly, a node herself. The cooling system breathed. The cluster's indicator lights pulsed in the dark behind the equipment wall, patient and regular as something alive. Layla Haddad sat in the sub-basement beneath Dubai at 22:51 Gulf Standard Time. 47 behavioral ghosts mapped across her screen, and understood for the first time that finding the pattern and being part of the pattern were not different things. They had never been different things. And whatever was assembling them, the 31, the 47, herself, the researcher 8 kilometers away writing questions in a notebook that no one was supposed to be able to read, was still learning what to do with them. Chapter 3. The cluster beneath the accelerator. The building had a name before it had a purpose. Helix Gate, rendered in brushed titanium lettering above a lobby of polished basalt and structural glass, the font selected by a branding consultancy in Amsterdam that charged more for the name than most buildings cost to furnish. The consultancy's brief had described the project as a next-generation innovation ecosystem anchoring Dubai's position at the intersection of deep tech and applied intelligence, which was the kind of sentence that meant everything and nothing simultaneously and was therefore perfect for its purpose. The lobby contained a reception desk staffed by 2 people who smiled with professional warmth at everyone who entered and knew, in detail, what none of them were actually doing there. The building's 42 above-ground floors housed, in ascending order, a co-working space marketed to early-stage startups, a suite of serviced offices occupied by entities whose corporate registrations were current and whose activities were not, 3 floors of what the directory called Deep Tech Incubation, and which contained, among other things, a computer vision laboratory funded by a Gulf sovereign wealth fund, a materials science team from a Korean conglomerate, and a cybersecurity firm that had been acquired 6 months ago by a holding company registered in Delaware whose ultimate ownership structure had not been publicly disclosed. Floor 38 was listed in the building management system as infrastructure and facilities, restricted access. It contained, in practice, the power and cooling management systems for the sub-basement. Specific to those systems were 2 dedicated electrical feeds drawing from separate grid nodes, a water cooling loop that connected to what the municipal records described as an industrial refrigeration installation, and a fiber bundle thick as a man's forearm running from street level down through reinforced conduit to a depth that did not appear in any plan filed with the Dubai Municipality Department of Building Permits. Layla had been given her access credentials on her first day by a man she had met only once in a hotel meeting room in the DIFC. He had told her his name was Marcus, which she had recognized immediately as the kind of name that was not a name but a function, a placeholder inserted where a name would normally go. He was British, or had been educated to sound British, in his middle 50s, with the specific physical quality of someone who had spent decades being unremarkable on purpose. He wore a suit that cost enough to signal seriousness and not enough to signal wealth. He had a watch she didn't recognize the brand of. He had offered her water and asked whether she had questions about the infrastructure before she started. She had asked 3 technical questions about the cluster's cooling architecture, which he had answered correctly and precisely, which meant he either understood quantum systems or had been thoroughly briefed by someone who did. She had not asked who was commissioning the work. He had not volunteered it. They had shaken hands. He had left. She had not seen him since, though she had the number of a secure messaging application on her phone that she had been told to use if operational requirements changed significantly. She had spent considerable time in the months since deciding what significantly meant. She was beginning to think she had found it. The sub-basement had 1 entrance accessible to her, a service elevator in the building's eastern core that required her biometric credential and a physical key card, both of which had to be presented within 4 seconds of each other or the system logged an anomaly and notified, she presumed, someone. The elevator descended past the basement parking level to a stop that did not appear on the panel. The doors opened onto a corridor of bare reinforced concrete, lit by LED strips in the ceiling that were always slightly too bright for comfort, creating a quality of light that was efficient and alienating in equal measure. 30 meters along the corridor, a steel door. Another biometric reader. Then the chamber itself. She had spent so many hours in the chamber that she had stopped consciously registering its dimensions. Perhaps 20 meters by 30, ceiling 4 meters, the floor divided into quadrants by the equipment architecture. The cryogenic towers dominated the space physically, their stainless steel housings rising to within half a meter of the ceiling, connected by a web of insulated piping to the cooling loop overhead. The ambient temperature in the chamber was 8 degrees Celsius, which was cold enough that she kept a jacket on the back of her chair and had learned in the first week that working without it produced a specific quality of discomfort that accumulated slowly and became impossible to ignore at around the 4-hour mark. The terminals were arranged along the chamber's south wall. 5 workstations, only one of which was hers, the others dark and unused, suggesting either that she had been hired as part of a team that never materialized or that whoever designed the space had anticipated a scale of operation that had since been quietly scaled back. She had asked Marcus about the other terminals in the first week. He had told her the other team members were working remotely. She had not believed this and had not pursued it. The cluster itself, the actual quantum processing architecture that justified everything else, was invisible. It was inside the cryogenic towers, suspended in baths of liquid helium at temperatures approaching absolute zero, because quantum coherence required the elimination of thermal noise to a degree that made the chamber's 8 degrees feel tropical by comparison. You could not see the processor. You could only see the machine built to protect it from the world's warmth. Layla had always found this quietly appropriate. The most powerful cognitive system she had ever worked with was also the most fragile, requiring a constructed environment of extraordinary artificial stillness just to function at all. She thought about that sometimes in relation to other things. On the morning after she had identified Node 39, the quantum researcher at the laboratory 8 kilometers away, she arrived at the chamber at 6:30, 2 hours before her normal start time, and began doing something she had been avoiding for 3 weeks. She started mapping the commission itself, not the model's outputs, the model's inputs, the data feeds, the funding architecture, the instruction set, the access permissions she had been granted, and the ones she had been refused. She had been building the model for 8 months and had spent almost all of that time looking at what it produced. She had spent almost none of it looking at what had produced it. She opened the access log. The cluster had been running continuously since the day she initialized it. During that time, 847 external data feeds had been active: financial transaction records, logistics management systems, communication metadata streams, behavioral analytics from commercial platforms, port operations data, maritime traffic records, civil aviation transponder feeds. The majority of these were legitimate commercial data products available by subscription. A minority were not. 17 of the 847 feeds carried access credentials she had been given without explanation, authentication tokens that opened data streams she could not trace to any commercial provider. She had assumed, in the early weeks, that they were proprietary government datasets accessed through some arrangement she was not intended to understand. She had used them without question because they were technically coherent and the data they provided was, in terms of the model's performance, exceptionally clean. She looked at them now with different eyes. She took the first token and ran it through the cluster's network analysis module, not a function she normally used for data governance, but one she had built into the architecture for security auditing purposes and had never deployed. The cluster traced the token's authentication chain. It took 11 minutes. The chain was long: 7 relay nodes, 3 anonymization layers, 2 jurisdictional crossings. At the end of it, the cluster produced not a source institution but a hash, a cryptographic fingerprint that identified a specific server without identifying its location or owner. She ran the same analysis on the second token. Different authentication chain. Same hash at the end. She did not need to run all 17 to know what she would find. She ran them anyway. 17 tokens. 17 different routing architectures. One hash. Someone had built 17 different roads to the same door and had given her the keys to all of them without telling her they were the same door. She sat with this for a while, with the cryogenic cooling system performing its perpetual exhalation around her, and thought about what it meant to have been handed a machine whose data sources converged on a single point she could not identify. She thought about the commission document's 6th page. The single paragraph. The system should be permitted to flag patterns that conventional analysis would discard as noise. She thought about the word permitted, which was not how you wrote an instruction to a machine. It was how you wrote an instruction to a person. She copied the hash to her encrypted partition. Then she opened a new analysis and asked the cluster a question she had been postponing for 3 weeks because she was not certain she wanted the answer. Who, if anyone, has accessed this system's output files externally since initialization? The cluster checked its access logs. 3 minutes. External access events, 0. Nobody had looked at the outputs. In 8 months of continuous operation, nobody from outside this chamber had read a single result. She stared at that. Then she understood. The commission was not interested in the outputs. The outputs were not the product. She pressed her palms flat against the desk and made herself breathe slowly and think this through without flinching. If the outputs were not the product, then what was? The process. The running of the model itself. Which meant the cluster was not a research system. It was a mechanism. And she, her expertise, her analysis, her 8 months of progressive refinement of the model's parameters, her careful expansion of the data feeds, her methodical identification of the 47 nodes, had not been hired to find something. She had been hired to build something. The question that followed from that arrived not quickly, but with the slow inevitability of something that had been there for a long time and was only now willing to be seen. Build what? At 9:15, she left the chamber for the first time in 31 hours. She rode the elevator up through the building's concrete strata, past the parking level, past the lobby stop she never used because it came out through the main atrium, and up to the 7th floor where there was a coffee station in a shared corridor between 2 co-working spaces. She had discovered it in her 2nd week and used it when she needed to be around people who were thinking about things that had nothing to do with what she was thinking about. She poured coffee. She stood at the corridor window, which looked north across the creek toward the older city, Dara, the gold and spice souks, the buildings that predated the hallucination of modernity by several decades, and sat low and salt-weathered in the morning light like a memory the city was trying to revise. A man she didn't know was standing 3 meters away, also holding coffee, also looking out the window. He was perhaps 40, slight build, wearing the standard issue informal uniform of the tech incubator world, dark trousers, an untucked shirt in a neutral color, shoes that were expensive in a way designed not to look it. He had a lanyard around his neck, but she was not close enough to read the name. He did not look at her. After perhaps a minute of this shared and parallel window gazing, he said, without turning his head, Dara still has the best shawarma in the city. They build these things and forget what was already here. Layla said nothing, which was her standard response to conversation from strangers in shared corridors. He glanced at her then, a brief, professionally calibrated glance that communicated neither hostility nor particular interest. Sorry, I talk to windows sometimes. Occupational habit. What's your occupation? I build things that are supposed to listen, he said. They end up being better at talking. He finished his coffee, set the cup in the recycling slot, and walked back down the corridor toward the co-working space. She watched him go. She thought, things that are supposed to listen. She did not follow him. She was not yet at the stage where she followed people. She filed the encounter in the part of her mind that had been accumulating data for 3 weeks under a heading she had not explicitly created, which was essentially things that might be significant, whose significance I have not yet determined. She went back to the elevator. She went back to the chamber. She sat at her terminal. She opened the model and asked it a question she had not expected to ask for at least another month. Is there any node in the current flag set located in this building? The cluster cross-referenced the behavioral profiles against the location data in its feeds. 43 seconds. 2 nodes detected within 200-meter radius of current terminal location. Node IDs, 22, 39. She already knew node 39. The quantum researcher. 8 kilometers away at Dubai Science Park. Node 22 was the municipal network engineer from Tallinn, who she also already knew. She reread the query. Within 200-meter radius of current terminal location. That meant inside this building, or nearly. She had profiled Node 22 as being in Tallinn. She had built his profile from data that placed him consistently in Estonia. His behavioral signature was dense with Northern European infrastructure, Estonian network systems, Baltic fiber topography, the specific rhythm of a mid-sized EU city's municipal tech environment. She checked the raw location data again. The model had pulled his location from 17 independent data sources. 16 said Tallinn. 1. A commercial device location feed she had plugged into the model 6 weeks ago and not interrogated closely since, said Dubai. She ran a timestamp check on the Dubai location data. The device had been in Dubai for 9 days. She checked the building's visitor management system, which she did not have access to through any legitimate channel, but which the cluster could reach through one of the 17 opaque data feeds whose tokens all traced to the same hash. She searched for arrivals in the past 9 days that matched any fragment of Node 22's profile. The system returned one result. A visitor access registration. Floor 23. A company she didn't recognize. The name on the registration, Tam. She checked the Estonian population registry, accessible through the same feed family. Christian Tam. Municipal Systems Engineer, Tallinn City Infrastructure Directorate. Currently on approved leave of absence. She looked at the visitor registration again. Floor 23. She was on the sub-basement level. She looked at the ceiling, as if she could see through 40 meters of concrete and steel and co-working infrastructure to wherever Christian Tam was sitting right now. She thought about what it meant that the model had flagged him weeks ago in Tallinn and he was now in this building. She thought about the quantum researcher in Dubai Science Park, the disgraced analyst she had not yet looked for in the dataset. The drone engineer in Seoul the model had been tracking for 5 weeks. She thought about the cluster's probability annotation on the latest convergence file, which she had generated the previous afternoon and had not yet allowed herself to read to the end. She opened it now. The annotation was 3 lines. Counter-coalescence trajectory confirmed across current node population. Rate of geographic concentration, accelerating. Projected convergence locus, Dubai. Probability, 0.81. She read the final line. External guidance probability, 0.68. She had read the first 2 lines yesterday and closed the file. She read the 3rd line now and did not close it. External guidance. Not the field guiding the nodes. Something else guiding the nodes toward the field. Or guiding the field toward the nodes. She did not yet have the framework to determine which direction the guidance ran. She had the hash. She had the 17th floor's silent history. She had the word permitted in a paragraph addressed to a machine. She had a man in a corridor talking to windows about listening. She had floor 23. She looked at the elevator. She looked at her terminal. She pulled up the cluster's real-time behavioral feed for the 47 nodes and watched the data scroll, the 1,000 small decisions occurring across the planet's time zones at this moment, each one a ripple in something she had named but not yet understood, each one part of a pattern pointing at something she was only beginning to be able to see. Then she locked her terminal, stood up, put on her jacket, and walked to the elevator. She pressed 23. The floor was quieter than she expected. A corridor of the same polished materiality as the rest of the building, but less populated. 3 doors on each side, all closed, all bearing company nameplates in the building's standardized format. A small rectangle of brushed metal, a corporate name in sans serif. The 3rd door on the left read, Lattice Systems, Advisory and Research. She had never heard of it. She stood in front of it. She was not sure what she intended to do. She was not an impulsive person. She had spent her career cultivating the discipline of not acting on incomplete information, and what she had right now was deeply incomplete. She had a name, Christian Tam, and a statistical fingerprint and the fact of his presence in this building 9 days ago, and a model that had predicted this convergence before there was a convergence to predict, and a commission she could not trace to a human face, and 17 data tokens that all led to the same door she could not open. She knocked. A pause. Voices inside, 2 of them, briefly overlapping. Then one of them approached the door. It opened. The man standing in the doorway was not Christian Tam. He was the man from the corridor. The coffee. Things that are supposed to listen. He looked at her without surprise. That was the thing she registered first and would think about longest afterward, the absence of surprise. Not the forced absence, not the trained blankness of someone who had been expecting her and was managing their reaction. Something quieter than that. He looked at her the way you looked at someone you had been waiting for long enough that their arrival had ceased to produce a feeling and become simply the next fact. Dr. Haddad, he said. She had not told him her name. You should come in, he said. There's someone here who's been running a model that keeps producing your facility as a data point. Behind him, at a desk covered in printouts she could not yet read, a man she had not met looked up. He was tall, pale in the specific way of people from high northern latitudes who had recently moved to intense equatorial light, and he was looking at her with an expression she recognized because she had worn it herself 3 weeks ago and had not fully taken it off since. The expression of someone who has found a pattern they do not yet have language for, and who has just found, in the shape of another person standing in a doorway, the beginning of the language. Christian Tam, the tall man said. His English carried the precise Baltic cadence she had heard in recordings. I was hoping you'd come up. He paused. The model suggested you might. I didn't know whether to believe it. Which model? Layla said. Mine, said Tam. Though I'm beginning to think that's the wrong word for it. She looked around the room. The printouts. A whiteboard covered in notation she needed to get closer to read. A laptop running something she couldn't see from the doorway. A coffee cup from the same station where she had spoken to the man from the corridor, which meant he had been on this floor this morning, which meant the window conversation had not been coincidental in any sense she could now believe in. She looked at the man who had opened the door. Who are you? She said. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering how much truth the question deserved. For now, he said, I'm the person who built the room you've been working in. He stepped back from the doorway. We've been waiting for you to run out of questions you could answer alone. She stood in the threshold for a moment. Behind her, the corridor, the elevator, the sub-basement, the cluster, running its model, scrolling its feeds, finding its ghosts. In front of her, 2 men who had, she was almost certain, been placed in her proximity by a mechanism she had spent 8 months building without knowing what she was building. She stepped inside. The door closed. Somewhere below them, 47 behavioral profiles scrolled across a terminal no one was watching. The number, by the time she came back down, would be 53. Chapter 4. Cognitive Drift. The room was smaller than she had expected. This was the first thought, which was the wrong thought. But the mind does what it needs to do in the presence of something it is not ready to process directly. It counts chairs, notes the quality of light, catalogs the distance between the window and the whiteboard, finds the ordinary dimensions of the space before it permits itself to look at what the space contains. For chairs, a table that had been pushed to one side to make room for the whiteboard, 2 laptops, 3 coffee cups, one of them hers, carried in from the corridor downstairs, a fact she had just understood. The window faced west, toward the older city. Afternoon light. Outside, a maintenance drone traced a slow diagonal between 2 towers and vanished behind a facade of reflective glass, absorbed into the city's own image of itself. The man who had opened the door said, My name is Abraham. He offered nothing else with the name. No institution, no title, no contextualizing clause. Just the name, delivered with the same quality of flat patience she had seen in his face in the corridor, which she now understood was not equanimity, but precision. He was not a calm person. He was a person who had learned to hold a great deal of motion very still, and the difference was visible, if you knew how to look for it, in the quality of control itself. She knew how to look for it because she was one also. She set her phone on the table, the gesture she used when she meant, I am not recording this. And I know you know I am not recording this, and I need you to know that I know. Abraham glanced at it and did not respond, which was its own kind of response. Christian Tam was standing at the whiteboard. He had the physical bearing of someone who processed ideas through movement, not pacing exactly, but a continuous minor repositioning, weight shifting, hands moving from pockets to the whiteboard ledge and back, as if his body needed somewhere to put the excess momentum of thinking. He was perhaps 38. The printouts on the desk were his. She could see the municipal header on the topmost sheet, Cyrillic characters in the footer, columns of time series data dense enough to suggest something very large being measured at very fine resolution. She looked at the data without yet being close enough to read it. Tam said, "How much do you know about traffic optimization?" "Enough to pass," she said. "Nothing structural." He nodded, as if this confirmed something. She understood she was being assessed, and that the assessment had begun before she knocked on the door, and possibly before she got on the elevator, and possibly before today. So he turned back to the whiteboard. Traffic optimization in a city like Tallinn operates on a feedback loop. The system collects real-time data from vehicle sensors, pedestrian flow monitors, transit GPS. It models the current state of the network. It projects forward 15 minutes, 30 minutes, and adjusts signal timing, tram frequencies, lane designations to optimize flow. The system is never perfectly accurate because the city is never perfectly predictable, but over 2 years the Tallinn implementation had reduced average commute delays by 22% and was performing, by every benchmark its developers used, at the upper boundary of the expected envelope. He paused. 8 months ago, the performance inversion began. She did not say anything. She had learned, in this room, in the past 4 minutes, that silence was the correct register for what these two men told her, because they were not telling her things they were uncertain about. They were telling her things they had been sitting with long enough that they had moved past uncertainty into something more uncomfortable. Tam touched the printout. By performance inversion, I mean, the city began running ahead of the optimization system rather than behind it. Not marginally, not within the noise floor. The vehicles, the pedestrians, the trams, the aggregate human movement of the city started anticipating the system's adjustments before the adjustments were made. Not sometimes. Consistently. Across a period of 8 months. The gap between what the system projected and what the city had already begun to do reached a peak of 22 minutes 6 weeks ago and has held at that level since. He looked at her. 22 minutes, she said. 22 minutes. The city is making the optimization system's decisions before the optimization system makes them. The light from the window was very precise at this hour. It fell across the printouts in a sharp diagonal and made the columns of data briefly, unusually legible. She could see the 2 time series lines now, the city's measured flow, the system's projected adjustments, separated by their 22-minute margin, running in parallel, perfectly coherent, like 2 instruments playing the same piece in an orchestrated delay. She thought about the shipping broker in Singapore who had canceled a cargo contract 48 hours before he had any reason to. The network engineer in Tallinn, Tam himself, who had sealed vulnerabilities he had not been asked to seal. The marine insurance underwriter in London who had declined a syndicate participation that her portfolio composition did not require her to decline. She said, "The city is a node." "Not a node," Tam said, and his voice carried something she had not heard in it before, a very controlled form of excitement. The excitement of a person who has been thinking alone for too long and has just heard someone say the correct thing. The city is the expression of nodes. Hundreds of thousands of them, moving in their small ways, each one locally rational. The aggregate, he gestured at the printout, the aggregate is 22 minutes ahead of the best model we have built to predict it. She turned to Abraham, because Abraham had not spoken since telling her his name, and she had the strong impression that he was the person in the room who had been thinking about this the longest. He was sitting in the chair farthest from the window, not because the light bothered him, she thought, but because the position gave him the whole room. He had a specific quality of stillness that she associated with people who had made consequential decisions and were waiting to make another one. He was watching her with attention she found difficult to characterize. Not clinical, not warm, something that was working harder than either. She said, "How long have you known?" He said, "That depends on what you mean by known." She waited. He said, "I have known that the optimization systems were inverted for 8 months, because Christian told me 8 months ago. I have known that the inversion was not an artifact for 6 months, because that is how long I spent trying to make it an artifact and failing. I have known that it was not confined to Tallinn for 4 months, because that is when I started looking at other cities and found the same inversion in transit data from Helsinki, Vilnius, and Singapore at varying magnitudes and developmental stages. And I have known that what was happening in the cities was the same phenomenon as what was happening in the behavioral data your cluster was processing for approximately 3 weeks, Because 3 weeks ago was when I asked the 17 access tokens to route me a live feed from your model's inference logs. The sentence arrived with the precision of something that had been prepared. She felt it land. She said, "You were watching my outputs." The access log, she remembered, had shown 0 external reads. She said this. Abraham nodded. "The access logs record retrieval events," he said. "What I was reading was not retrieved from your cluster. It was replicated to a parallel buffer by one of the 17 feeds in real time, without touching the retrieval pathway. The log was accurate. The log was also incomplete, which is a different thing." She thought about the hash. The 17 tokens. 17 different roads to the same door. She said, "The commission." He inclined his head very slightly, which was not confirmation so much as an acknowledgement that the word was in the right vicinity. She said, "The commission built the cluster and gave it to me." He said, "The commission built the cluster and needed someone to run it. Someone with the technical architecture to model what the cluster could see and the intellectual integrity not to explain away what the model found. You were not selected arbitrarily." "How was I selected?" A pause. A considered pause, not evasive. More the pause of someone deciding how much of the answer was constructive. "The field selected you," he said, "in the sense that you had already been exhibiting enhanced decision coherence for 4 months before we contacted you. In the sense that the cluster, when we initialized it with a training set of early behavioral profiles, produced your CV as a primary candidate match without being explicitly tasked to do so. We treated that as a signal. It was a signal. She had been inside the field for 4 months before she knew the field existed, making decisions that were, in aggregate, pointing her here, to this sub-basement, this building, this cluster, this elevator, this room, this conversation." She said nothing for what might have been 30 seconds. Then she said, "Field effect." She had written those 2 words in a notebook 11 days ago, and then crossed them out, and then written them again. She had said them aloud to no one. She had not put them in any digital document. They had existed only in her handwriting on folded paper in her jacket pocket. Abraham looked at her with the expression of someone hearing a note struck correctly after a long period of deliberate listening. "Yes," he said, "that is what it is." The phrase existed in her private notes and was now in the room, spoken by someone who had not read her private notes, which was either coincidence or evidence, and she had run enough validation sequences to know what she did with evidence. "Field effect," Tam said, and the phrase in his mouth had the cadence of something he had used before, not casually, but with the care of a tool that was fragile and important. The way you set a measurement when you understood the measurement might be wrong and set it anyway because you had nothing better. Cities, people, behavioral gradients that rhyme across distances and jurisdictions with no communication linkage between them. The same phenomenon at the scale of a single individual and at the scale of an urban population. The same signature in the inference logs of a commercial traffic system and in the outputs of your behavioral model. He sat down for the first time since she had entered the room. It was, she thought, a gesture of something having been passed. Abraham said, "The cluster was not built to detect the field." She looked at him. He said, "We built a system that produces the optimal conditions for the field to express itself in detectable data. The architecture, the specific data feeds, the instruction to lower significance thresholds, these were not methodological choices for a detection system. They were environmental choices. We were not designing a telescope. We were designing a medium." "A medium," she said. "The cluster interacts with the field," he said, "not passively. The model's inference processes, the pattern detection, the gradient mapping, the coherence calculations running continuously across the 47 behavioral profiles, generate a specific computational signature that the field responds to. That is why the node count keeps growing. Not because we are finding more nodes. Because the cluster's operation is creating conditions that make it easier for nodes to recognize themselves." She heard this. She let it move through her. She said, "The cluster is a node." "Yes." "And I am a node." "Yes." And the cluster running the model for 8 months, the model that was looking for field coherence, was itself an act of field coherence. He said, "The most consequential act." "Yes." The cooling system was 8 floors below her, and she could not hear it from here, but she felt its absence as a specific quality of silence. The silence of thinking without the machine that had been thinking alongside her. A silence in which the thinking was somehow required to proceed under its own resources. She looked at the whiteboard. Tam's notation covered it in 3 colors: black for the data, blue for the deviations, red for the rate of change. The red lines were steepening. Whatever was expressed in red had been accelerating. She said, "What happens at the rate the red lines suggest?" Tam looked at the whiteboard as if he had been waiting for someone to ask. He said, "At current rate of inversion growth across the 6 cities, the traffic optimization systems become effectively decorative within 14 months. The cities will be routing themselves with greater accuracy than any model we have built to predict them. The models will still function. They will still generate outputs, but the outputs will be trailing indicators rather than leading ones. Documentation, not guidance. And that is only cities," Abraham said. "With the infrastructure we can measure. The same process, running in domains we cannot instrument. In the behavioral data of populations we have no sensor grid for. In institutional decision-making, in the distributed choices of systems we have never thought to treat as systems, has presumably been running for longer and at greater depth." "Presumably," she said. "Probably," he said. "There is no certainty available here. There is only the model and the model's limits and the decision about what to do with the space beyond the limits." She thought about the 41-word annotation the cluster had generated on the night. She asked it about the 3 nodes: the shipping broker, the underwriter, the port manager. Anticipatory knowledge. Mechanism of information transfer, unresolved. The cluster had named the thing it could not explain with 5 words. Mechanism of information transfer. That were, she now understood, not a description of a gap in the model's knowledge. They were a description of the field itself. The field was the mechanism of information transfer. The cluster had named the answer by naming the question. She looked at Abraham. She said, "Who is the commission?" He was quiet for a moment in the way that she was learning to read as a particular kind of consideration, not reluctance, not evasion, but the specific thought process of someone deciding how much truth was useful. He said, "The commission is people who found what you found before the infrastructure existed to find it, who understood what the field was before we had the tools to model it, who spent, in some cases, decades determining how to build an instrument that could see it clearly rather than distort it by the act of observation." He paused. "People like you and Christian are finding the field because the field has matured to the point where it is findable. 30 years ago, it was not findable. 30 years ago, someone who understood what it was had to find it differently, through decades of careful attention to the places where the data was wrong, where the models failed in patterned ways, where human coordination exceeded every mechanical explanation. Through patience, through the accumulation of evidence that could not be published because it had no institutional category to be published in." She said, "And the commission built the cluster too. To accelerate," he said, "not the field. The field does not need acceleration. To accelerate recognition. To give the field the tools to see itself. Because the field seeing itself is different from the field operating unseen, and the difference matters." How does it matter? He considered this. She had the sense he had thought about it for a very long time and was still not satisfied with any single answer. He said, "A system that does not know it is a system cannot make decisions about what it is for." The window. The older city. The afternoon light moving across the printouts. The 2 time series lines on the whiteboard, separated by 22 minutes, running in parallel toward whatever the red rate of change lines described. She said, "Is there a threat?" Not a question. She had been working in intelligence-adjacent environments for long enough that she could hear the difference between her own uncertainty and something that required the shape of a question. "Yes," Abraham said, "there is a threat." He said it the way she had said it, not as something that needed elaboration yet, but as a fact being placed in the room for all 3 of them to stand around and look at from the appropriate distance before deciding what to do about it. The nature of the threat, she thought, was probably not simple. The nature of the threat was probably related to the fact that the field seeing itself also meant the field being visible to anyone else who was looking, and that the cluster she had been running for 8 months, the instrument built to accelerate recognition, was also, by its nature, a landmark, a source of light in a dark landscape. And light, in landscapes where other things were moving, served 2 functions simultaneously. She said, "How many people know what we are talking about right now?" Abraham said, in this depth? 3. She looked at Tam. 4. Tam said, there is someone else. Abraham said, her name arrives in the model's outputs tomorrow morning. I have been watching the trajectory for 2 weeks. I did not want to front-run it. She looked at him. He said, the model should make its own introductions. That was how it introduced you. Below them, the cluster continued its work, the pattern detection, the gradient mapping, the coherence calculation scrolling across the terminal no one was watching, the behavioral profiles of 53 people making small decisions in 17 countries for reasons they could not explain, each decision a letter in a language no one had yet assembled into words. The chamber was 8 degrees Celsius, and the cryogenic towers held the processor at the temperature of deep space, and the light through the window above was warm and ordinary, and the coffee in her cup was cold. She picked it up anyway. Held it. She said, what do we do first? Abraham said, you go back down and ask the cluster who else it has been waiting to introduce us to. Let it work. Don't constrain the parameters. And then? He looked at her with the expression of someone who has been managing an enormous patience for a very long time and has just found, in the arrival of another patient person, the first condition for releasing it. Then we find the others, he said, before the field does it for us. Chapter 5. The paperwork of invisibility. The file had been there since the beginning. This was the thing she would return to later, not with guilt exactly, but with the specific retrospective discomfort of someone who had looked at a thing many times and not seen it, which is different from not looking. She had looked. The file had been in the cluster's search logs since the day she initialized the model. She had reviewed the logs methodically, the way she reviewed everything, with the patience that her work required and her temperament enforced. She had read the query strings, assessed the data access patterns, mapped the model's early exploratory behavior against the instruction set's parameters. She had seen the file. She had not understood what it was. This distinction, between seeing and understanding, between a fact in the visual field and a fact in the mind, would later seem to her like one of the cleaner illustrations of what the field did and did not do. The field did not install knowledge. It created conditions. The conditions had been present for 8 months. The knowledge had been waiting in the search logs, unretrieved, for a mind ready to receive it. The mind had needed the conversation on the 23rd floor before it was ready. She came back down from Abraham at 1640. She made tea, not from the sub-basement's electric kettle, which produced water that tasted of the building's pipes, but from the thermos she had started bringing 3 weeks ago when she first understood she was going to be spending longer hours in the chamber than the original contract had implied. She sat at her terminal. She opened the cluster's search logs from the initialization period, the first 30 days, before she had tuned the model toward its current architecture, when the system had been running exploratory queries across the data feeds to establish baseline behavioral profiles. She had reviewed these logs twice in the early months. Both times she had been looking for methodological artifacts, patterns in the model's exploratory behavior that might introduce bias into the baseline. She had found 3 minor artifacts and corrected them. She had not been looking for the content of the queries themselves. She was looking now. The logs were organized chronologically, each entry recording the query string, the data feeds accessed, the retrieval volume, and the timestamp. 14,000 entries in the first 30 days. The model had been industrious. She began scrolling, slowly, with the specific quality of attention that she had learned was different from reading. Looser and more peripheral, less focused on individual entries and more attuned to the texture of the whole, the rhythm of the queries, the places where the rhythm changed. She found it on day 11. It was not a large deviation. In the context of 14,000 queries, it was 3 consecutive entries that ran slightly against the grain of the surrounding material. 3 retrievals from a data feed she did not immediately recognize, pulling documents that the cluster had classified under a topic taxonomy she had not assigned to any of its primary analytical threads. The feed identifier, ARC DOC 0009. She checked her feed registry. ARC DOC 0009 was one of the 17 opaque tokens, one of the 17 roads to the same hash. She had not examined its content closely before because the 17 feeds had all appeared to be behavioral data streams, transaction records, logistics flows, communication metadata. She had used them as inputs to the model without interrogating what, exactly, they contained. ARC-DOC-0009 was not a behavioral data stream. She opened the feed's content index. It was a document archive, several hundred files, a mixture of formats, organized under a filing taxonomy that was not the cluster's own. Someone had built this archive separately and connected it to the cluster through the same anonymous routing architecture as the behavioral feeds. The taxonomy used category headers she did not recognize at first, then recognized slowly, with the sequential arrival of familiarity that came when encountering a field of knowledge adjacent to but not inside one's own. Strategic doctrine. Historical. Contemporary. Applied. She opened the first document the cluster had retrieved on day 11. It was a monograph, 43 pages. No author listed. No institutional affiliation. No date of publication, though the footnote style and several internal references placed it, tentatively, in the early 2000s. The title was a transliteration from Arabic, Taqiya, from concealment doctrine to active architecture, followed by a subtitle in smaller text, on the strategic reinterpretation of passive dissimulation as an operational methodology for conflict environments in which combatant and civilian populations are structurally indistinguishable. She read the first paragraph standing up because she had been sitting for 6 hours and her body had made a unilateral decision about this, and then she forgot she was standing and read the next 4 pages without moving. The monograph's argument was precise and, in its precision, quietly vertiginous. The original doctrine of Taqiya, the theological permission to conceal one's beliefs under conditions of existential threat, a protection for the persecuted, had undergone, the author argued, a strategic mutation. Not corruption, mutation. In the hands of a specific category of practitioner, the doctrine had been reinterpreted not as a shield but as an architecture. Not concealment as protection, but concealment as method. The practitioner who does not hide their identity, but instead constructs an identity so thoroughly ordinary, so completely consistent with every category the surveilling apparatus is trained to examine, that the practitioner becomes, in the operative sense, invisible by being maximally visible. The mask that becomes the face. The author used that phrase twice. The second time with a footnote directing the reader to a figure she did not yet know, Ibn Maimon. The footnote said only, see the primary sources. The abode is older than the modern infrastructure. The doctrine precedes the doctrine. She made a note of the name. She set it aside. The monograph's final section was the part she read 3 times. It described what happened when the concealment architecture was not applied to an individual but to a network. When the network was not a conspiracy, not a group of people in coordinated communication with shared objectives, but a distributed structure of practitioners, each operating independently, each maintaining a life of complete ordinarity, each producing, in the aggregate, outcomes that could not be traced to any of them individually, because there was no communication to trace, no coordination to detect, no structure that the apparatus was built to find. On paper, the author wrote, such a network is invisible because it does not exist. Its members are exactly who their documents say they are. Their transactions are exactly what the ledgers describe. Their relationships are exactly what the communication records contain. There is nothing defined because there is nothing hidden. There is only the mask, which has become the face, which is the face, which is also the mask. The distinction collapsed to the point of meaninglessness by the discipline of decades. The practitioner of this architecture, the author wrote in the document's final paragraph, is not concealed. They are indistinguishable. She looked at the word that was also the novel's name, which was also not the novel's name yet, which was sitting in a search log 11 days into the cluster's initialization history, retrieved by a machine that had been looking for behavioral coherence among people with no communication linkage and had, on day 11, before any human being had asked it to, before she had built the detection framework that would eventually find the 47 nodes, reached into an archive of strategic doctrine and pulled the conceptual infrastructure for what it was finding. The model had found this before she did. The model had understood the category before she built the tools to populate it. She went back to the search log. She looked at the 2 subsequent entries, the second and third documents the cluster had retrieved from ARC-DOC-0009 on day 11. The second was a chapter from a larger work, 7 pages, again no author, dealing with what the author called the verification paradox, the structural problem encountered by any intelligence apparatus attempting to identify practitioners of the concealment architecture. The paradox ran as follows. The apparatus was built to find people who did not match their documentation, people whose financial behavior contradicted their declared profession, whose travel patterns were inconsistent with their stated purpose, whose communications contained frequencies or vocabularies or contact patterns that deviated from the expected. The apparatus was, in essence, a deviation detection system. The practitioner of the concealment architecture produced no deviations. Or rather, and this was the operative insight, the practitioner produced the precisely correct number of deviations. Not zero, which would itself be a deviation from the behavior of an ordinary person, since ordinary people made small mistakes, had minor inconsistencies, deviated in the low-amplitude ways that all human behavior deviated. The practitioner produced those deviations. The practitioner's documentation was the documentation of a person so plausibly ordinary that the documentation was, paradoxically, slightly more complete than ordinary documentation tended to be, because ordinary people did not curate their ordinariness, and so their ordinariness had gaps, and the practitioner's ordinariness had been curated to perfection and therefore had no gaps. And the absence of gaps was itself a signal, barely detectable, barely above the noise floor, visible only to an apparatus tuned to a resolution that no apparatus currently deployed was tuned to. She thought about the 17 access tokens, the shell companies, the corporate identities layered above the subbasement, the commission that could not be traced to any government, any known intelligence service, any identifiable individual. She thought about the commission document's 6th page. She thought about Abraham, who had told her his name and offered nothing else with it. She thought about what it would look like, in any database anywhere, if you ran a standard identity check on a person who had spent a very long time making sure that what appeared in databases was exactly what should appear. Exactly the right employment history. Exactly the right property records. Exactly the right small debts and minor civic interactions and unremarkable professional associations. Not the absence of a life, but the presence of a life so perfectly calibrated to the resolution of the apparatus that the life was, in the apparatus's terms, completely legible and completely opaque. She thought about the word indistinguishable and felt it arrive in her understanding with the particular weight of a word that had been waiting for the correct moment and had now found it. She opened the 3rd document. It was shorter than the others, 11 pages, and stylistically different, denser, less discursive, more annotated. It had the character of working notes rather than finished argument. The header read, Field Survey, Doctrine Practitioners, Selected Case Studies, compiled for internal review. Case studies. She read through them. There were 5. Each described, in the anonymized language of intelligence tradecraft, an individual who appeared, in every standard data environment, to be exactly what they were documented as being. A logistics professional, a civil servant, a retired academic, an import-export broker, a systems engineer at an infrastructure firm. For each one, the document described the point at which a different kind of analysis, non-standard, the note said, operating below conventional significance thresholds, had identified a deviation not in the individual's documentation but in the individual's effect. Not who they were, but what happened near them. The slight but consistent drift in the decisions of people in their networks. The outcomes that exceeded the explanatory power of the individual's documented role. The way that events, in their vicinity, tended to resolve in specific directional ways that, taken individually, could each be explained and, taken in aggregate, could not. The apparatus, the note said, was not built to see this. The apparatus sees identity. This requires something the apparatus was not designed to do. It requires seeing relationship. Not the relationship between the individual and their documentation, but the relationship between the individual and the field in which they were operating. The field that their activity shaped. The field that shaped their activity. The loop. She stopped reading. She went to the cluster's initialization logs. Not the search logs now, but the architecture logs, the record of how the model had been built before she arrived. She had looked at these once, in the first week, to understand the system she had been handed. She looked at them again, now, knowing what she was looking for. The model's initial configuration, the parameters that had been set before she touched anything, specified a detection target that she had read in the first week as a standard behavioral correlation task. She read it again. Instances of coordinated behavioral change among individuals who share no detectable communication linkage. She had read coordinated and parsed it as a property of the behavior, a description of what the model was looking for. She read it again now and heard the word differently. Coordinated was not a property of the behavior. It was a property of the field. The model had not been initialized to find people who were conspiring. It had been initialized to find people who were doing what the case studies described. People whose behavior was shaped by the field and who were, in turn, shaping it, without communication, without structure, without the apparatus having any existing category for what they were. The model had been initialized to find, in the population, people who were operating the way the concealment doctrine described. Not practitioners of the doctrine, not the architects of deliberate invisibility, but people in whom the field produced the same signature. People who were, in the apparatus's terms, exactly who they appeared to be and, in the field's terms, something else simultaneously. She pressed her palms flat on the desk. Cold desk. The chamber's 8 degrees. She needed to think about this carefully. The concealment doctrine, as the monograph described it, was a method, a deliberate practice, a discipline. It described what a person could do, with sufficient training and commitment, to make themselves operationally invisible. The field was not a method. It was not practice or discipline or commitment. It was a condition, something that existed in the relationship between nodes, not in any individual node, not controllable by any individual, not deployed by any individual. The field produced coherence without communication because coherence did not require communication if the nodes were sufficiently aligned in their orientation. The field produced outcomes that exceeded individual agency not through conspiracy, but through resonance. The question that arrived then, slowly, the way the important questions arrived, carrying weight, was this. What would it look like if someone had understood the field and used the doctrine to enter it deliberately? Not to build the field. You could not build the field. The field was not built. The field was the relationship, and the relationship was not constructed but was the natural expression of a sufficient density of aligned nodes in proximity. But to enter the field, to design a life, a documented, perfectly ordinary, indistinguishable life, that placed you at a specific location within the field, that gave you access to the field's effects without being visible to the apparatus that was looking for you, that allowed you to introduce something into the field, a modification, a redirection, a subtle shift in the weights, while appearing, in every category the apparatus could examine, to be exactly who you said you were. She looked at the search log entry again. Day 11. Before she was running any analytical framework. Before she had found the first node. Before the 41-word annotation. Before everything. The model had retrieved these documents on day 11 because the commission's instruction set had been designed to send it there. The instruction set had been designed by people who had read these documents, who had built the archive that contained them, who had constructed, around the archive, 17 anonymous data feeds leading to the same hash, accessed through a cluster commissioned through a funding structure of such complexity that no intelligence service had been able to identify the source, who had built a room and hired a person to sit in it, and given the person a machine and waited. She had been thinking of the commission as the people who found the field before she did, who understood it, built instruments to see it, were now asking her to help them understand it better. She was sitting in the sub-basement beneath a building in Dubai, and she was revising that understanding in real time, with the particular quality of attention required when the revision involved not a correction to a peripheral detail, but a shift in the foundational assumption underlying everything. The commission had found the field. That remained true. The commission had also, the documents in ARC, DOC 0009 suggested, spent decades thinking about what it would mean for someone else to find the field first. To find it and recognize it not as something to understand, but as something to use. Someone who had read the concealment doctrine not as history, but as a technical manual, and who had been patient enough, patient in the way the monograph described, the patience of decades, to build a life, or many lives, or a network of lives, that placed them inside the field's architecture before the apparatus existed to see them there. She thought about what 3 weeks ago Abraham had said and had not said. The threat, placed in the room, not elaborated. She thought about the query on day 11 and what it meant that the machine had gone looking for the concealment doctrine before she had given it the tools to find anything else. As if the instruction set had been designed to orient the model toward this before it was oriented toward anything else. As if whoever built the instruction set had understood that the concealment doctrine was not context, not background, not intellectual framework, but foreground. The primary fact. The thing the model needed to understand first, before it understood anything about the field, because without it the field was a phenomenon, and with it the field was a conflict. She looked at the terminal. She looked at the search log. She looked at day 11, timestamp 342. Not a time of day she had ever been in this chamber. Not a time she would have been in this chamber during the initialization period, weeks before she had been given the access credentials and told to come to work. The model had retrieved the doctrine documents at 3:42 on day 11 of its operation. She had been hired on day 14. She had started work on day 15. The model had gone looking for the concealment doctrine before she arrived. She wrote one line in her encrypted file, underneath the previous entries. Someone queried the doctrine. Before I was here. The hand behind the installation was already inside the field. The apparatus we have built to find it may have been built, in part, by the thing we are trying to find. She held that thought. She did not rush it. She let it settle at whatever depth it needed to settle. Then she wrote a second line. Or, the commission understood this possibility and built the machine anyway, because finding it was the only option available. Because a field that can be used by someone who understands it and does not know it is more dangerous than a field known to all parties. She saved the file. She looked at the chamber wall. She looked at the cryogenic towers. She thought about Abraham, who had said, "The field does not need acceleration. What needs to accelerate is recognition." She thought about what recognition meant if the thing being recognized had been operating deliberately and patiently inside the field for longer than the instruments had existed to detect it. She thought about the 47 nodes making small decisions in 17 countries for reasons they couldn't explain. She thought about whether any of them, any of the 47, were making those decisions freely, in the field's own idiom of spontaneous coherence, or whether any of them were making those decisions because someone who understood the field had spent years making sure they would. She thought about whether the difference was detectable. She thought about whether the difference, at sufficient resolution, was even real. The cluster ran its inference processes in the dark behind the equipment wall. The indicator lights pulsed. 53 profiles. 53 sets of small decisions, accumulating in the data. Somewhere in the aggregate, somewhere in the space between the behavioral gradients and the field effect that connected them, a pattern that had been in operation for longer than the model had existed to see it, running through the same substrate, using the same mechanism, looking, on paper, exactly like everything else. Indistinguishable. She got up. She put on her jacket. She stood in the center of the chamber for a moment and looked at the terminal and looked at the search log still open on the screen, day 11, timestamp 342, and thought about everything that had been in that query and everything the query had been unable to tell her about who made it. Then she sat back down. She was not going to stop working. She was going to work differently. She opened a new analysis. She directed it not at the 47 nodes, but at the Commission's 17 data feeds, the archive, the behavioral streams, the 17 roads to the same hash, and asked the cluster a question whose answer she was not certain she wanted and was certain she needed. Is there evidence, within any of the 17 access feeds, of a behavioral signature consistent with coordinated field activity, operating prior to my initialization of this model? The cluster considered this for a long time. 3 minutes. 7. 11. At 14 minutes and 22 seconds, it produced not a visualization and not a text annotation, but something she had not seen the system generate before, a flagged uncertainty report. A document the cluster produced when a query fell outside the bounds of what it could answer with meaningful confidence. When the pattern it was detecting was real enough to report and ambiguous enough that reporting it without caveat would be, the system's documentation said, epistemically irresponsible. She read the flagged uncertainty report. It was 6 paragraphs. She read it slowly. The first paragraph said, pattern detected. The 6th paragraph said, The behavioral signature identified in the pre-initialization data is consistent with coordinated field activity. It is also consistent with the operational behavior of the commission itself, with the individuals who built this system and who are known to analyst Haddad. The model cannot determine whether the signature represents a threat actor or a principal. The model notes that this ambiguity may be irresolvable by analytical means alone. She sat in the cold of the chamber for a long time. The model could not tell her whether the shadow in the data was the hand that had built the installation or the hand that the installation had been built to find. Both hands looked, in the field, exactly like each other. That was either the problem or the answer, and she did not yet know which. Part 2, White War, in which the conflict is named by someone who died centuries ago. Discussion about this episode. Comments. Restax. Recent episodes. Prodigy LLC Jen Bankasi. March 10th, MXDM aka Pirate 1 VJ Tsunami X. Prodigy LLC La Banca del Genoma. March 9th, MXDM aka Pirate 1 VJ Tsunami X. Il Ben a Commune Cognitivo. March 9th, MXDM aka Pirate 1 VJ Tsunami X. Prodigy LLC O Banco Genetico.